Weathered wooden buildings scatter along the dusty road in Thunder Basin, Wyoming, once bustling during the gold rush of the 1860s. In the valley stands Elkhorn Ranch, a 130-year-old property now fallen into disrepair. Sarah Mitchell, a 42-year-old widow desperate to save her husband's legacy, discovers strange markings on the basement wall. When she chips away at one stone, she uncovers a hidden chamber. Secrets from Wyoming's territorial days are about to surface. Secrets that some of the state's most powerful families would kill to keep buried forever. The morning frost glittered across the withered grasslands as Sarah Mitchell's worn boots crunched over the frozen ground of what had once been her family's pride. She surveyed the 200 acres of what locals now mockingly called Mitchell's Folly, a cattle ranch in Thunder Basin, Wyoming, that hadn't turned a profit in 5 years and was scheduled for bank foreclosure in exactly 72 hours if she couldn't produce the $125,000 in back payments. The January wind cut through her jacket like a knife, reminding her that Wyoming winters showed no mercy to failing ranches or desperate widows. At 42, Sarah had never imagined herself as a rancher. She was a successful curator at the Cheyenne Museum of Western Heritage, someone who preferred climate-controlled galleries to harsh Wyoming winters. But the ranch had been in her late husband Robert's family for 3 generations, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing the last connection to the man she'd loved for 17 years. In the distance, the Grand Tetons stood silent and indifferent, their snow-capped peaks turned golden by the morning sun. The same mountains had witnessed the first Mitchell stake his claim here in 1892, buying the property from a man named Samuel Crawford, who had built the original homestead in 1885. 3 generations of Mitchells had worked this land, surviving droughts, blizzards, and economic downturns. Until now, the property had been plagued with misfortune ever since Robert's grandfather had purchased it. Cattle diseases, equipment breakdowns, and 3 catastrophic droughts had driven away 4 different ranch managers. The locals whispered about the Mitchell curse, but Sarah knew the real problem was simpler: outdated infrastructure, mounting debt, and the relentless competition from corporate ranching operations that had gradually squeezed out family-owned properties across Wyoming. "You really should just walk away," said Frank Wilson, her late husband's childhood friend and the only real estate agent willing to handle the property. He had driven out from Cheyenne to help Sarah with what everyone assumed would be her final visit before surrender. "The bank's offer to forgive the remaining debt if you sign over the deed is generous, considering the property's troubled history." Sarah pulled her coat tighter against the biting Wyoming wind, her eyes fixed on the old ranch house that had stood since 1885. Robert had died there 8 months ago, collapsing in the basement while searching through old family records. The doctors called it an aneurysm. Sudden, unpredictable, impossible to prevent. By the time Sarah found him, he had been gone for hours. "I know it doesn't make financial sense," Sarah replied, studying the foreclosure notice that had arrived that morning. Thunder Basin Ranch, 200 acres, historic homestead, circa 1885, original stone foundation, working well, $485,000 or minimum bid, property sold, as is due to ongoing federal land survey complications. The last line had puzzled potential buyers, but Sarah had researched the survey issue. It appeared to be a routine geological assessment related to water rights that affected several ranches in the valley. Nothing that should significantly impact the ranch's value. "I can't explain it, Frank," she continued, "but I feel like I owe it to Robert to try one more time. He was so convinced this place held some kind of secret. He spent his last months obsessively researching the property's history, going through old county records, even consulting with treasure hunters and historians." Frank shook his head, kicking at a clump of frozen earth, but that was just Robert being Robert, always chasing dreams and legends, always believing there was more to this place than just land and cattle. "I've already spent most of my savings trying to keep up with the mortgage," Sarah acknowledged. "My curator job barely covers my apartment rent in Cheyenne. I can't save a ranch that's been failing for decades." Sarah had done the math countless times. Between her museum salary, Robert's modest life insurance, and a loan against her retirement fund, she could maybe hold on to the property for another 3 months. Her plan was ambitious, and probably foolish: convert part of the historic ranch house into a high-end retreat focused on Western heritage and art, partner with the museum for cultural tours, and maybe develop a small historical center highlighting the ranch's connection to Wyoming's gold rush era. The ranch sat along what had once been a crucial route for gold prospectors heading to South Pass in the 1860s. Robert had discovered references to the property in old miners' journals suggesting the original owner had been involved in the gold trade in ways that went beyond simple ranching. If Sarah could prove this connection and get the property listed on the National Register of Historic Places, there might be grants and tourism opportunities. It was a long shot, but the alternative was watching Robert's beloved ranch sold at auction to the highest bidder. "Have you heard back from the Wyoming Historical Society about the gold rush research?" Frank asked as they approached the ranch house. Dr. Running Bear seemed interested. Sarah replied, referring to the indigenous historian who specialized in 19th century Wyoming history. "But she needs more than family stories to support a historic designation. The documentation requirements are extensive." The wind picked up, cutting through Sarah's jacket as she looked across the barren fields. The cattle herd that should have been thriving was down to just 40 head, another casualty of the severe drought that had plagued central Wyoming for the past 3 years. Even if she could somehow save the ranch from foreclosure, the environmental challenges seemed insurmountable. "Remember when we used to come out here for summer barbecues?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a note of nostalgia. "Robert would drive us out from Cheyenne and his grandmother would have that big table set up on the front porch. The cattle were healthy then, grazing as far as you could see." Frank nodded, his expression softening. "Grandma Mitchell made the best bison chili in Thunder Basin. Robert always said this place was magical, that it held secrets nobody else knew about." Maybe that's what Sarah was really trying to save. Not just the property, but the secrets, the history that dies with a place when it's sold to developers or corporate ranching operations. She pulled out her phone and showed Frank the pictures Robert had taken during his research, screenshots of old county records, photographs of faded documents, and images of the strange markings he'd found carved into the basement stone walls. "Look at this," she said, swiping through the photos. Robert found these references in the Wyoming State Historical Society archives, journals from prospectors in the 1860s talking about a safe house in Thunder Basin. They never mentioned the exact location, but the descriptions match our property perfectly. Frank studied the images, his skepticism wavering slightly. "These journals are real copies of originals held at the Historical Society." Dr. Running Bear confirmed their authenticity, but she says we need physical evidence, not just documentary references, to prove the gold rush connection. And Sarah showed him another photo, a crude map drawn on aged leather showing routes through Wyoming, with symbols marking what appeared to be caches or safe houses. One symbol, circled in Robert's handwriting, appeared to correspond to their property's location. Robert was convinced that the ranch house basement held evidence, she continued. He spent months down there, carefully removing layers of paint and concrete, looking for hidden compartments or passages left by the original builders. "And did he find anything?" Frank asked. Sarah hesitated. "He died before he could finish his work, but in his final weeks he was more excited than I'd seen him in years. He kept saying he was close to something big, that he'd found proof that would change everything." They reached the ranch house porch where Robert's old rocking chair sat covered in a thin layer of ice. Sarah paused, remembering the evenings they'd spent there planning their future together. He'd been so passionate about the ranch's potential, so convinced that its history held the key to their financial salvation. "Frank, what if Robert was right? What if there really is something significant here?" Frank considered this carefully. "Like what? A forgotten gold cache? Those are just stories old-timers tell to keep their property values up." Robert believed there was more to it than just stories. "The night before he died, he called me absolutely ecstatic. He said he'd found the entrance and needed to check one more thing before showing me. I thought he was just being dramatic, but what if he actually found something?" Frank's expression turned serious. "Sarah, people have been searching for lost gold in Wyoming for over 150 years. If there was anything valuable on this property, someone would have found it by now." "Maybe they weren't looking in the right place," Sarah replied. "Or maybe they didn't have the information Robert had. He spent years collecting historical documents, cross-referencing accounts, mapping potential locations." As they entered the ranch house, Sarah felt the familiar ache of loss. Robert's presence still lingered in every room. His books on Western history stacked on the coffee table, his collection of antique mining tools displayed on the walls, his half-finished cup of coffee still sitting on his desk where she'd left it, unable to wash away this last trace of his living presence. The main floor showed signs of Robert's research obsession, walls covered with maps and timelines, bookshelves overflowing with historical accounts of Wyoming's gold rush, and boxes of documents obtained from archives across the state. But it was clear that his real focus had been elsewhere. "He barely touched the upper floors," Sarah noted. "All his energy went into the basement. He was obsessed with the foundation, with the idea that the original builders had hidden something significant there." Frank examined the historical materials with growing interest. I have to admit Robert was thorough. This is impressive research. Robert had researched the original owner, Samuel Crawford, who arrived in Wyoming Territory in 1885. According to county records, he was a cattle rancher from Colorado who claimed to be starting a new life after the mining boom. But Robert found evidence suggesting Crawford had connections to major gold transport operations from South Pass to the railroad stations. Sarah led Frank to a wall where Robert had hung a timeline of his research. Photos, documents, and maps were connected by red string, creating a web of evidence that suggested the ranch's true purpose. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a photograph of a gravestone. Robert found this in the Thunder Basin Cemetery. Samuel Crawford died in 1892, just 7 years after building the ranch house. The inscription says he was a guardian of fortune and keeper of secrets. And that's an unusual epitaph for a simple rancher. It is strange, Frank agreed, and here's another interesting part. Crawford's death certificate lists the cause as injuries sustained in a riding accident, but Robert found a newspaper clipping from 1892 that mentions Crawford was found dead in his basement, apparently having fallen down the stairs. Frank frowned. That's an odd discrepancy. Robert didn't think it was a discrepancy. He thought Crawford might have been killed to keep quiet about whatever was hidden on the property. The gold rush era was over, but there were still fortunes being made and lost and plenty of people with reasons to hide their wealth or their crimes. Sarah moved toward the basement door, drawn by the same curiosity that had consumed her husband's final months. She'd avoided the basement since his death, unable to face the space where he'd drawn his last breath. But today, with foreclosure just 3 days away, she felt compelled to see what had captured his attention so completely. "I need to go down there," she said quietly. "I need to see what Robert was working on." The basement stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the cool, dim space below. A single bare bulb hung from the stone ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the rough walls. Robert had been working to restore the original stone foundation, removing decades of paint and concrete to reveal the craftsmanship beneath. The basement was larger than typical ranch house foundations, with walls that were nearly 3 feet thick in some places. The stonework was precise and deliberate, each block fitted with the skill of a master mason. In the center of the space, Robert had set up a makeshift workspace, tables covered with tools, brushes, and chemicals for cleaning stone. His research materials were carefully organized on shelves along one wall, photographs, notes, and historical reference materials. Robert was always talking about these stones, Sarah said, examining the carefully fitted blocks. He claimed they were arranged in a specific pattern, that the builders had incorporated some kind of code into the foundation itself. Frank joined her, running his hands along the restored sections. "I have to admit, this is different from other basements I've seen. These stones are massive, and the way they're fitted together, it's almost like they're protecting something." Sarah knelt to examine a section where Robert had been working before his death. He'd removed several layers of paint and concrete, revealing what appeared to be carved symbols on some of the stones, faint markings that looked intentional rather than random. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of small marks etched into one stone. Robert thought these might be prospectors' symbols, codes used to communicate with other gold transporters about cache locations. The symbols were crude but deliberate, a series of lines and curves that formed patterns Sarah didn't recognize. Robert had made rubbings of them, and she could see several hanging on the basement walls alongside his research materials. He documented everything. Sarah continued, gesturing to the walls covered with Robert's notes, photographs, and sketches. Every symbol, every unusual stone, every measurement of the foundation. He was building a comprehensive record of the basement construction. Frank studied the symbols more closely. "These do look intentional. If they're original to the construction, they predate any modern alterations." Sarah moved to Robert's workspace, where his final notes were still spread across the table. His handwriting, normally neat and precise, had become hurried and excited in the final weeks before his death. "Listen to this," she said, reading from his last journal entry, April 18th. "Found additional symbols on the north wall. Pattern suggests a sequence, possibly directions. The stones in this section show signs of being movable. I believe I'm close to finding the vault referenced in the Crawford letters." Jack looked up sharply. "Vault." Sarah nodded, continuing to read. April 20th, confirmed that 3 stones on the north wall are not mortared in place. They appear to be designed to move in sequence. Tomorrow, I'll attempt to access the space behind them. If the Crawford accounts are accurate, what lies beyond could change everything. The entry was dated the day before Robert's death. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized how close he had been to making his discovery, and how tragically his life had been cut short just at the moment of potential triumph. "Frank, we need to check the north wall," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Robert died trying to find this. I owe it to him to finish what he started." They moved to the north wall where Robert had cleared away decades of concrete and paint to reveal the original stonework. Sarah could see the symbols he'd referenced in his notes, crude markings that appeared to form a pattern across several large stones. "These three," she said, pointing to a section where the stones looked slightly different from the surrounding masonry. Robert thought these could be moved. Frank examined the stones carefully. The mortar around them does look different, newer, as if someone had removed and replaced them at some point. Sarah began pressing on the stones, looking for any sign of movement or mechanism. At first nothing happened, but as she applied pressure to the stones in the sequence indicated by the symbols, she felt a slight give in the central stone. "There's something here," she said, excitement building in her voice. "Help me push." Together they applied pressure to the stone, which gradually began to move inward with a grinding sound that suggested it hadn't been disturbed in decades. As the stone receded, Sarah could see darkness beyond, a space that shouldn't exist according to the basement's visible dimensions. "My God," Frank whispered. Robert was right. With renewed effort, they managed to move the stone far enough to create an opening about 2 feet square, large enough for a person to crawl through. The passage beyond was dark, but Sarah could see that it opened into a larger space about 10 feet in. "I'm going in," she announced, already reaching for the flashlight on Robert's workbench. "Sarah, wait," Frank cautioned. "We don't know what's in there. The structure could be unstable." "Robert found this, Frank. He was about to discover whatever's hidden here when he died. I need to see it through." And before Frank could object further, Sarah switched on the flashlight and began maneuvering herself into the opening. The passage was tight but navigable, and after a few feet she could feel it beginning to open up. "There's a chamber here," she called back to Frank. "It's bigger than I expected. I'm going to stand up." As Sarah emerged into the hidden space, the beam of her flashlight revealed something that took her breath away. The chamber was roughly 15 feet square, with walls of precisely fitted stone rising to a vaulted ceiling. But it was what the chamber contained that made Sarah's heart race. Along one wall stood a row of wooden crates, their surfaces covered with dust but otherwise remarkably preserved in the cool, dry environment. In the center of the room sat what appeared to be an old safe, not a modern security device but a vintage bank vault dating from the late 1800s. "Frank," Sarah called, her voice echoing in the confined space. "You need to see this. It's incredible." Frank's worried face appeared in the passage opening. "What do you see?" "Crates, a safe, and what looks like mining equipment. This is definitely a hidden storage room. Robert was right about everything." Frank squeezed through the opening, joining Sarah in the hidden chamber. His expression of skepticism had been replaced by one of wonder as he surveyed the contents. "This is," he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "This is exactly what Robert was looking for." Sarah moved closer to the crates, examining them in the flashlight beam. Each was marked with faded stenciling, C&H, shipping, and what appeared to be serial numbers. With trembling hands, she tried to lift the lid of the nearest crate but found it securely nailed shut. "We'll need tools to open these," she said, turning her attention to the safe. The old vault was about 4 feet tall, its metal surface etched with decorative patterns, and the name Crawford prominently displayed on the door. "Do you think there's anything still inside?" Frank asked, examining the safe-style mechanism. "Only one way to find out," Sarah replied. "But we'll need the combination." They searched the chamber for any clues that might help them open the safe but found nothing obvious. The mining equipment, picks, shovels, and what appeared to be old sifting pans, gave no indication of the safe's contents or how to access them. "Let's check Robert's notes," Sarah suggested. "He was methodical. If he found any clues about a combination, he would have documented them." They returned to the basement where Sarah began carefully reviewing Robert's final journal entries. His excitement was palpable in the hurried handwriting and exclamation points that punctuated his discoveries. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an entry dated 3 days before his death. Robert found a series of numbers carved into one of the basement stones. He thought it might be significant. 1842, 733. "A combination," Frank suggested. "Possibly." He notes that the sequence matches the pattern typically used for safes of that era. Right, left, right, left. They returned to the hidden chamber where Sarah carefully approached the safe. The dial mechanism was stiff with age but still functional. With Frank holding the flashlight, she began to turn the dial according to the sequence Robert had documented. 18 right, she murmured, turning the dial slowly. 42 left, 7 right, 30 left. When she completed the sequence, she tried the handle. For a moment, nothing happened, and Sarah felt a wave of disappointment. Then, with a reluctant groan of metal that hadn't moved in decades, the handle turned and the safe door began to swing open. "It worked," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The safe's interior was lined with what appeared to be lead sheeting and contained several canvas bags, a stack of leather-bound ledgers, and a small wooden box. Sarah carefully removed one of the canvas bags, which was heavier than she expected. As she loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm, she gasped. Gold coins spilled into her hand, not modern currency but vintage double eagles, their surfaces gleaming as if they had been minted yesterday. "Frank," she said, her voice shaking, "these are $20 gold pieces from the 1880s. They're worth far more than their face value now, thousands each to collectors." Frank examined one of the coins, his expression stunned. "How many are there?" Sarah quickly assessed the remaining bags. "There are 12 bags this size, if they're all full of similar coins." She turned her attention to the ledgers, carefully opening the top one to reveal pages of meticulous handwriting. The entries detailed shipments of gold from various mining operations, amounts, dates, and what appeared to be coded references to individuals involved in the transactions. "These are transaction records," she said, skimming the pages. "This wasn't just a storage facility, it was part of an organized operation moving gold from the mines to markets." "Legal operations?" Frank asked. "I'm not sure," Sarah replied, continuing to examine the ledgers. "Some of these entries reference official shipments, but others mention private transactions and use code names instead of proper documentation. The wooden box was the last item in the safe. Unlike the utilitarian canvas bags and functional ledgers, it was ornately carved with what appeared to be a family crest. Sarah carefully lifted the lid to reveal a collection of personal items. A pocket watch, several letters, and a small leather-bound journal. "This must have belonged to Samuel Crawford," she said, opening the journal. "It's a personal account of his activities." As she read the first few entries, Sarah's understanding of the ranch's history began to shift dramatically. Samuel Crawford hadn't been a simple rancher. According to his own words, he had been a facilitator for wealthy mine owners who needed to move and store their gold outside official channels. Sometimes to avoid taxes, sometimes to hide the true extent of their wealth, and sometimes for more nefarious purposes. "Listen to this," she said, reading from the journal. "March 1888, received shipment from H. Miller's operation. Official records show 60% of actual yield, remaining 40% stored in vault for private distribution. Commissioner Williams received usual consideration for document adjustment." "He was helping mine owners hide their true production," Frank said. "Probably to avoid taxes and government oversight," Sarah added, "and paying off officials to look the other way. But there's more. Crawford was skimming from these private reserves. Listen, December 1888, added personal percentage to primary vault. Current holdings sufficient for European resettlement if arrangements with Prescott become untenable." He was building his own fortune from what he skimmed, Frank concluded, a middleman taking advantage of his position and creating an escape plan in case he was discovered. "But he never used it," Sarah added. "He died here in 1892. As they continued examining the safe's contents, the true scope of their discovery began to emerge. The canvas bags contained not only gold coins but also raw gold nuggets and small ingots. The ledgers documented transactions spanning 7 years involving some of Wyoming's wealthiest mining operations. And Crawford's personal journal revealed a complex web of corruption, blackmail, and theft that had allowed him to amass a significant fortune while serving as the trusted agent of powerful men. "Sarah," Frank said, his voice serious, "do you realize what we found here? This isn't just a few gold coins. Based on these records and what's in these bags, we're looking at millions in historic gold, maybe tens of millions given today's collector values." Sarah sat back on her heels, the implications of their discovery washing over her. The failing ranch that had seemed like such a burden now contained a treasure that could change everything. But as the initial shock began to fade, new questions emerged. "If this is all still here, why didn't Crawford use it?" she asked. According to his journal, he was planning to flee to Europe with his fortune. What stopped him? Frank examined the final entries in Crawford's journal. The last entry is dated April 15, 1892. He died on April 22nd, according to the death certificate. There's no explanation of what happened in that final week. "And how did Robert figure all this out?" Sarah continued. "He must have found clues I haven't seen yet." They returned to the basement to review Robert's research more thoroughly. His notes revealed a methodical investigation spanning years. County records, historical accounts, geological surveys, and architectural assessments of the ranch house. Here, Sarah said, finding a folder labeled Crawford Connections. Robert traced connections between Samuel Crawford and various mining operations through bank records and business filings. He discovered that Crawford had worked for Wells Fargo before coming to Wyoming, specifically in their gold shipment security division. So he had the perfect background knowledge to set up his own operation, Frank observed. Exactly. And Robert found references to Crawford in the private papers of several mine owners, always in context of special arrangements or private banking services. As they pieced together Robert's research, Sarah began to understand why her husband had been so excited in his final weeks. He hadn't just been chasing a vague treasure legend. He had systematically uncovered evidence of a specific hidden fortune, assembled clues to its location, and been on the verge of accessing it when he died. "Frank," she said quietly, "what do we do now?" Frank considered the question carefully. "First, we need to secure what we found. Then we need legal advice. This gold has been hidden for over 130 years, but it still belongs to someone. Crawford died without heirs. The mine owners he stole from are long gone. The ranch has changed hands multiple times since then." "That's why we need legal advice," Frank replied. "But Sarah, as the current property owner, you may have the strongest claim to what's been found here." The implications were staggering. If Sarah could establish legal ownership of the treasure, the failing ranch would transform from a financial burden into a fortune. The foreclosure threatening in just 72 hours would become irrelevant. Her financial struggles would end overnight. But as the initial excitement began to fade, Sarah felt a growing unease. If Robert had been this close to discovering the vault, had his death truly been natural? The timing seemed too convenient, finding the entrance one day, dying the next. "Frank," she said slowly, "do you think Robert's death might not have been an accident?" Frank frowned. "What do you mean, the timing?" "He finds the entrance to the vault, calls me excitedly, saying he's about to make a huge discovery, and then dies before he can show anyone. Doesn't that seem suspicious?" "You think someone killed him to prevent the discovery. The medical examiner ruled it a natural death, an aneurysm." "I know, but..." Sarah hesitated, unsure how to articulate her growing suspicion. What if someone else knew about the vault? What if Robert wasn't the only one researching Crawford's secrets? As if in answer to her question, the sound of a vehicle approaching the ranch house drew their attention. Through the small basement window, Sarah could see an unfamiliar black SUV pulling into the driveway. "Are you expecting anyone?" Frank asked, moving to the window. "No," Sarah replied, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. They watched as two men in suits emerged from the vehicle, surveying the property with the calculated assessment of professionals rather than the casual interest of visitors. "They don't look like bank representatives," Frank observed. "Or real estate agents," Sarah added. "They look like federal agents," Frank finished her thought. The men approached the front door, and Sarah and Frank could hear the firm knock even from the basement. Their discovery, hidden for over a century, had somehow drawn attention within hours of being found. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered. Frank considered their options. "If they're legitimate federal agents, we should cooperate. If not..." The unspoken implication hung in the air between them. Their incredible discovery had suddenly become complicated in ways neither of them had anticipated. The treasure that could save the ranch might also put them in danger from forces they didn't yet understand. "Close the vault," Sarah decided. "Replace the stone. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we reveal what we found." They quickly returned to the hidden chamber, closing the safe and making sure nothing appeared disturbed. Then they carefully moved the stone back into place, concealing the entrance to the secret room that had remained hidden for over a century. As the knocking at the front door grew more insistent, Sarah and Frank prepared to face whatever complications their discovery had unleashed. The failing ranch had revealed its secrets, but those secrets came with consequences neither of them had anticipated. "Ready?" Frank asked as they reached the top of the basement stairs. Sarah took a deep breath, thinking of Robert's excitement, his belief in the ranch's hidden potential, and his untimely death on the verge of discovery. "Ready," she replied, squaring her shoulders. "Let's find out who else knows about Samuel Crawford's vault." The failing cattle ranch that had seemed like such a burden now held a $200 to $1 million secret, and Sarah Mitchell was about to discover that some inheritances come with unforeseen complications. Sarah Mitchell stood in the ranch house foyer, her heart pounding as she opened the front door. The two men in dark suits regarded her with professional detachment. "Sarah Mitchell?" the taller agent asked, his voice clipped and formal. "Yes, that's me," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm Special Agent Dominic Reeves with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, presenting credentials. "This is my partner, Special Agent Marcus Chun. We'd like to ask you some questions about this property." Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Frank, who had positioned himself strategically beside her before inviting the agents inside. The living room with its scattered research materials and maps suddenly seemed incredibly incriminating. "What brings the FBI to Thunder Basin?" Frank asked, attempting to sound casual. Agent Reeves's eyes scanned the room, taking in Robert's research materials with obvious interest. "We're investigating a series of historical artifact thefts across Wyoming. Several items connected to the gold rush era have disappeared from private collections and small museums over the past 3 years. And this concerns me." "How?" Sarah asked, fighting to keep her voice neutral. "Your late husband, Robert Mitchell, made inquiries about several of these artifacts before they disappeared," Agent Chun said, pulling out a small notebook. "His name appears in visitor logs at the affected museums, and he corresponded with several of the collectors." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but clear. They suspected Robert had been involved in the thefts. "My husband was a historical researcher," Sarah said firmly. "He was writing a book about Wyoming's gold rush era. Of course, he visited museums and contacted collectors." Agent Reeves nodded as if he'd expected this response. "Mrs. Mitchell, we're not accusing anyone of anything. We're simply following leads in an ongoing investigation." "Your timing is interesting," Frank interjected. "The bank is foreclosing on this property in less than 3 days. Why this sudden interest now?" The agents exchanged a glance that Sarah couldn't quite interpret. "We received new information that suggested Mr. Mitchell might have discovered something significant shortly before his death," Agent Chun replied. "Something connected to the original owner of this property, Samuel Crawford." Sarah's blood ran cold. How could they possibly know about their discovery so quickly? They had only found the vault minutes ago. "What kind of information?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "A letter was discovered among the effects of Gregory Mills, a collector whose gold rush artifacts were stolen last year," Agent Reeves explained. "It was from your husband, claiming he had found evidence of a significant historical cache on this property. The letter was dated 3 days before his death." Sarah remembered the letter. Robert had reached out to several historians and collectors in his final weeks, seeking additional information about Crawford's connections. But he had been deliberately vague about his discoveries, never mentioning the vault or the hidden entrance. Robert was excited about his research, she acknowledged. But historical significance doesn't always mean monetary value. "Of course," Agent Chun nodded. "We're simply trying to determine if there's a connection between your husband's research and these thefts. Would you mind if we had a look around the property?" "Do you have a warrant?" Frank asked bluntly. Agent Reeves smiled thinly. "We don't need one if Mrs. Mitchell gives us permission. Otherwise, we can certainly obtain one." Sarah knew she needed time to think, to figure out the implications of what they'd discovered and determine the best path forward. Allowing federal agents to search the property now when they had just found the vault seemed incredibly risky. "I'd prefer if you did get a warrant," she said finally. "This has been a difficult day and I'd like some time to process everything." The agents accepted this with professional courtesy, though Sarah could see the disappointment in their eyes. They left business cards and promised to return the following day, either with a warrant or to continue the conversation. As the black SUV pulled away from the ranch house, Sarah turned to Frank with a look of disbelief. "How could they possibly know about the vault? We just found it." "They don't know about the vault specifically," Frank reasoned. "They know Robert was researching something significant related to Crawford. That could mean many things." "But the timing," Sarah insisted. "It can't be coincidence that they show up minutes after we make the discovery." "Maybe not," Frank admitted. "But right now, we need to figure out what we've actually found and what it means legally. We have less than 3 days before the bank forecloses." Sarah nodded, focusing on the immediate challenge. "I should call Dr. Running Bear. If anyone can help us understand these documents and their historical significance, it's her." Frank agreed, but as Sarah reached for her phone, he placed a hand on her arm. "Wait, let's follow them first." "Follow them? Why? Something doesn't feel right. Those credentials look legitimate, but if they were really FBI, why not just get a warrant in the first place? Let's see where they go." 20 minutes later, they were in Frank's truck, following the black SUV at a discreet distance along Route 26 toward Cheyenne. Instead of heading to the regional FBI office, however, the vehicle turned onto a private road leading to an imposing gated property on the outskirts of town. "That's the Prescott estate," Frank said, slowing the truck to avoid detection. "As in Senator William Prescott." Sarah knew the name well. The Prescott family was Wyoming royalty, 3 generations of political power founded on banking and ranching fortunes that dated back to territorial days. Senator William Prescott was currently serving his 3rd term chairman of the Senate Natural Resources Committee and one of the state's most influential political figures. Why would FBI agents be visiting Senator Prescott? Sarah wondered aloud. Maybe they're not FBI at all, Frank suggested grimly. They watched as the black SUV passed through the security gate and disappeared up the long driveway to the main house. We need to get back to the ranch, Sarah said decisively, and I need to talk to Dr. Running Bear immediately. Dr. Catherine Running Bear arrived at the ranch 2 hours later. At 61, the Shoshone historian was a respected authority on Wyoming's territorial era and had worked with Robert on several research projects. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her weathered face showed both wisdom and concern as Sarah explained their discovery. I always believed Robert was onto something significant, Dr. Running Bear said, examining the journal entries Sarah had shown her. But this is beyond anything I imagined. May I see the vault? Sarah led her and Frank back to the basement where they carefully moved the stone to reveal the hidden chamber. Dr. Running Bear's academic detachment momentarily faltered as she stepped into the space and saw the safe, the crates, and the mining equipment. This is extraordinary, she whispered, running her fingers lightly over the nearest crate. A perfectly preserved gold transport vault from Wyoming's territorial period. She moved methodically through the chamber, documenting everything with her camera, paying special attention to the markings and construction techniques. This chamber wasn't built by amateurs. These are techniques used by professional vault builders of the era, the same people who constructed bank vaults across the West. Sarah explained their encounter with the supposed FBI agents, and their subsequent discovery about Senator Prescott. Dr. Running Bear's expression grew serious. That complicates matters significantly. The Prescott family has deep connections to this region's development, not all of them savory. She picked up one of the ledgers, carefully turning its brittle pages. These transaction records are extraordinary. They document an entire shadow economy operating alongside the official gold market. Shadow economy? Frank asked. The official history of Wyoming's gold rush focuses on registered claims, documented production, and recorded transactions, Dr. Running Bear explained. But there was always a parallel system. Unreported production, private transport networks, off-the-books sales. This vault was part of that system. She pointed to specific entries in the ledger. These names, HP, tons JW, TM, they're coded references to some of the territory's most prominent figures. And look here, H. Prescott private arrangement 40% withholding. That would be Harold Prescott, the senator's great-grandfather. Sarah felt a chill run through her. You're saying Harold Prescott was involved in Crawford's operation, not just involved, Dr. Running Bear replied, turning to another page. Based on these records, he appears to have been Crawford's primary client, moving significant quantities of gold through this vault, all of it undocumented. The foundation of the Prescott fortune might well be built on gold that never officially existed. The implications were staggering. Senator William Prescott's family legacy, the political dynasty that had shaped Wyoming for generations, might have been founded on systematic fraud. That would explain why those men were at the Prescott estate, Frank said. If the senator somehow learned about Robert's research, about what he might have discovered, Sarah's mind raced to connect the dots. But how would he know Robert was careful about his work? He didn't share his suspicions widely. Dr. Running Bear considered this. Robert reached out to me about 3 months before he died, asking about Harold Prescott's connections to early mining operations. I pointed him to some archives at the University of Wyoming that hold the Prescott family's donated papers. If he accessed those materials, his research would have been logged. And if someone in the Prescott family monitors those records, Frank began. They would have known Robert was investigating their family history, Sarah finished. The three returned to the house, bringing several of the ledgers and journals with them for closer examination. As the afternoon stretched into evening, they methodically documented their findings, with Dr. Running Bear providing historical context for the transactions described in Crawford's records. Based on these entries, the historian said, pointing to a series of notations from 1889, Crawford was helping Harold Prescott conceal gold revenues from both his business partners and territorial tax authorities. In modern terms, we'd call this money laundering. How much are we talking about? Frank asked. Dr. Running Bear made some quick calculations. Conservatively, these records document approximately 12,000 ounces of gold moved outside official channels between 1885 and 1892. At today's values, that would be worth roughly $24 million in raw gold. But the numismatic value of these coins would multiply that figure substantially. And the historical value is incalculable, Sarah added, thinking of the museum implications. Precisely, Dr. Running Bear agreed. These documents reveal an entirely hidden chapter of Wyoming's development, how wealth was actually accumulated and distributed during the territorial period. The historical community would consider this a find of extraordinary significance. As they continued their analysis, Sarah discovered a folder in Robert's records labeled Prescott Claims. Inside were copies of mining claim registrations from the 1880s, along with Robert's detailed notes suggesting systematic fraud. Robert found evidence that Harold Prescott used territorial officials to invalidate legitimate mining claims, she explained, showing the documents to the others. Once the original claimants were forced out, Prescott would re-register the claims under his own name or the names of associates. That was unfortunately common practice during that period, Dr. Running Bear confirmed. But having documentary evidence linking a specific family to such practices is extremely rare. Most of these records were conveniently lost or destroyed, which makes these ledgers and journals even more valuable historically, Sarah said, understanding now why Robert had been so excited by his discoveries. And potentially dangerous, Frank added grimly. If these records prove the Prescott fortune was built on fraud. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their discussion. Through the front window, Sarah saw 3 black SUVs pulling into the driveway, headlights cutting through the evening darkness. The FBI agents are back already. Frank moved to the window, then stiffened. That's not the FBI. There are at least 6 men out there, and they're armed. Dr. Running Bear quickly gathered the most important documents. Is there a back way out of here? Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a block number. With trembling fingers, she answered and put it on speaker. Mrs. Mitchell, came a smooth, authoritative voice. This is Senator William Prescott. I believe you've found something that belongs to my family. I'd appreciate if you'd invite my security team inside so we can discuss this matter privately. Sarah exchanged alarmed glances with Frank and Dr. Running Bear. The implications were clear. Prescott knew about their discovery and had sent armed men to secure it. Senator Prescott, Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. This is unexpected. What exactly do you think we found? Let's not play games, Mrs. Mitchell, the senator replied, his voice hardening slightly. Your husband's research led him to certain historical records relating to my family's business interests during Wyoming's territorial period. Those records are private family property removed from our archives without authorization. That's not possible, Sarah countered. Robert conducted legitimate historical research using properly accessed public archives. Nevertheless, Prescott continued smoothly, any materials relating to the Prescott family holdings during that period are covered by a confidentiality agreement with the State Historical Society. My team is there to retrieve those materials and ensure any copies are deleted. This is a simple matter of family privacy. Outside, the armed men had taken positions around the house. They were dressed in tactical gear with no visible insignia, carrying themselves with a military precision. I don't think I can accommodate your request tonight, Senator, Sarah said firmly. It's late and I'd prefer to have my lawyer present for any such discussion. Mrs. Mitchell, Prescott's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. You're facing foreclosure in 3 days. I can make that problem disappear with a single phone call, or I can ensure the bank enforces every penalty clause in your mortgage. The choice is yours. The threat was unmistakable. Senator Prescott was offering to save the ranch in exchange for the documents, or to guarantee its loss if she refused. I'll need time to consider your offer, Sarah replied, stalling for time. My men will wait, Prescott responded. I'll call again in 1 hour. I suggest you make the sensible decision. The line went dead. Sarah looked at Frank and Dr. Running Bear, her mind racing through options. We need to get these documents to safety, Dr. Running Bear said urgently. The historical record must be preserved regardless of whose reputation it damages. But they've got the house surrounded, Frank pointed out. How do we get past them? Sarah's thoughts turned to the hidden chamber and the mining equipment they'd found there. Robert was convinced this property was connected to the underground gold road, the secret transport network used during the territorial period. That's right. Dr. Running Bear nodded. The network included hidden routes, safe houses, and escape tunnels. Stations were typically about a day's ride apart. What if, Sarah began, excitement building despite their predicament. What if the hidden chamber isn't just a vault? What if it's also a junction in the underground gold road? The three hurried back to the basement and the hidden chamber. This time they conducted a more thorough examination of the space, looking not just at the safe and crates but at the construction of the chamber itself. "These walls," Dr. Running Bear said, running her hands along the stonework. "They're different on this side, rougher, less finished, almost as if they were meant to be temporary," Sarah finished. "A false back wall." Frank directed his flashlight to where Dr. Running Bear was indicating. "There's a seam here. It's subtle but definite." Together, they began pressing on different sections of the wall, looking for a mechanism similar to the one that had opened the entrance to the chamber. After several tense minutes, Dr. Running Bear found a loose stone near floor level. When pressed in sequence with two others, a section of the wall swung inward with a grating sound of stone against stone. Beyond lay a narrow tunnel, its walls reinforced with timber supports that had somehow withstood the passage of 130 years. "My God," Frank whispered. "An escape tunnel." "The underground gold road," Dr. Running Bear confirmed. This would have allowed Crawford to move gold in and out without being observed and to escape if the main house was threatened. Sarah felt a surge of vindication for Robert's research. He had been right about everything: the vault, the gold, the ranch's connection to the underground transport network. "Where do you think it leads?" Frank asked, peering down the dark passage. "Us. Based on what we know about similar tunnels, probably to a concealed exit somewhere on the property," Dr. Running Bear suggested. "Perhaps in one of the outbuildings or a hidden entrance in the hillside." Sarah made a quick decision. "Frank helped me gather the most important documents: Crawford's journals, the ledgers with the Prescott entries, and Robert's research notes. Dr. Running Bear, can you create a digital backup of as much as possible?" The historian nodded, already photographing pages with her phone. "I'll send everything to my university email as we go. Even if they confiscate our devices, the records will be preserved." For the next 30 minutes they worked frantically, documenting, gathering, and preparing. Sarah found a canvas satchel in Robert's workspace that would allow her to carry the most critical materials. Meanwhile, Frank prepared flashlights, water, and basic supplies for their escape through the tunnel. "What about the gold?" Frank asked, indicating the safe and crates. "We can't move it," Sarah said practically. "It's too heavy and not as important as the documentary evidence. The gold proves there was wealth here, but the ledgers and journals prove where it came from and how it was obtained. That's what matters historically." As they finished their preparations, Sarah heard the sound of breaking glass from upstairs. Prescott's men had apparently grown tired of waiting. "They're coming in," Frank said urgently. "We need to go now." Dr. Running Bear finished her last photograph and pocketed her phone. "The tunnel is our only option." Sarah cast one last look at the vault that had been hidden for more than a century. The treasure that could have saved the ranch financially but had instead revealed a truth far more valuable. Then she turned and led the way into the dark passage, carrying Robert's legacy and the hidden history of Wyoming's development in the satchel clutched to her chest. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing them to proceed in single file, slightly hunched over. Frank led the way, flashlight illuminating the rough-hewn passage that sloped gradually downward. The air was surprisingly fresh, suggesting some form of ventilation system had been incorporated into the design. Crawford was thorough, Dr. Running Bear observed quietly as they moved. "These support timbers are original Douglas fir treated with creosote for longevity. This wasn't a hastily constructed escape route. It was engineered to last." They had progressed perhaps 100 yards when they heard muffled shouts echoing from behind them. Prescott's men had found the hidden chamber. "They'll find the tunnel entrance soon," Frank warned. "We need to move faster." The passage began to curve, following what Sarah guessed was the natural contour of the hillside below the ranch house. After another 200 yards, they encountered a junction. The main tunnel continued forward while a narrower passage branched off to the right. "Which way?" Frank asked, his flashlight illuminating both options. Dr. Running Bear examined the timber support at the junction. "There's a mark here, an arrow pointing right. It's one of the navigation symbols used by the underground gold road operators." They took the right passage, which climbed more steeply. The air grew noticeably fresher, and Sarah sensed they were approaching the surface. After another 50 yards, the tunnel ended at what appeared to be a solid rock face, but closer inspection revealed hinges cleverly disguised within the natural stone patterns. "A door," Sarah realized. "But how does it open from this side?" Frank ran his hands along the edges of the rock face, eventually finding a recessed iron handle almost invisible in the shadows. When pulled, it released a mechanism that allowed the door to swing inward, revealing a starlit Wyoming night. They emerged into a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, the ranch house visible as a collection of distant lights approximately a quarter-mile away. The exit had been disguised as a natural rock formation, completely invisible unless one knew exactly what to look for. Where are we exactly? Frank asked, orienting himself. The northeast corner of the property, Sarah replied, recognizing a distinctive rock formation silhouetted against the night sky. Near the old line cabin, the sound of vehicles and shouting voices carried from the direction of the ranch house. Flashlight beams swept the property as Prescott's men expanded their search. They'll find the tunnel exit eventually, Dr. Running Bear said urgently. We need to get these documents to safety. My truck is parked behind the barn, Frank said. Too risky. They'll have it watched. My car is hidden on the access road about half a mile east, Dr. Running Bear offered. I always park away from main buildings when examining historical sites. Less chance of damage to potential artifacts. Good thinking, Sarah said gratefully. Let's go. They moved carefully through the trees, keeping to shadows and avoiding open ground. The night was clear and cold, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Behind them, the commotion at the ranch house suggested Prescott's men were becoming increasingly desperate in their search. After 20 tense minutes of cautious progress, they reached Dr. Running Bear's weathered Jeep Cherokee concealed behind a stand of junipers off the rarely used eastern access road. We should split up, the historian suggested as they reached the vehicle. I'll take the documents to the university archive. They can be properly preserved and secured there. What about the digital copies? Sarah asked. Already sent to my department head and 2 colleagues, Dr. Running Bear assured her. The historical record is safe regardless of what happens next. Where should we go? Frank asked. Prescott will have men watching your apartment in Cheyenne, Sarah. I have a contact at the state police, Dr. Running Bear said, starting the Jeep's engine. Captain James Blackhawk, I'll call him as soon as I'm on the main road, explain that armed men have invaded private property, but you two shouldn't be there when the police arrive. Too many questions. The Thunder Basin Motel, Sarah decided. It's anonymous cash only and the owner doesn't ask questions. We can lay low there until morning, then figure out our next move. They quickly transferred the satchel of documents to Dr. Running Bear's vehicle. As the historian prepared to depart, she clasped Sarah's hand firmly. Your husband was right, Sarah. What you found isn't just treasure. It's history that was deliberately buried. Robert would be proud of what you're doing. As the Jeep's taillights disappeared down the access road, Sarah and Frank began the long walk to the Thunder Basin Motel 3 miles distant. The night was bitterly cold, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was processing the extraordinary events of the day. The discovery of the vault, the revelation of the Prescott family's secret past, and the desperate effort to preserve historical truth against powerful forces determined to keep it buried. Do you think Prescott's men will find the tunnel exit? Frank asked as they walked. Eventually, Sarah replied. But by then the documents will be safe. That's what matters. They reached the Thunder Basin Motel shortly after midnight, a modest single-story establishment on the outskirts of town that had seen better days. The neon vacancy sign flickered erratically, casting an intermittent red glow across the nearly empty parking lot. The night clerk accepted their cash without question and assigned them a room at the far end of the building. Once inside the sparse but clean room, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge the exhaustion that had been building since their discovery in the basement. What happens now? Frank asked, sitting heavily on one of the twin beds. We wait to hear from Dr. Running Bear, Sarah replied. Once the documents are secure, we can decide how to proceed legally. And the ranch, the foreclosure is still happening in less than 3 days. Sarah sighed, the weight of that reality settling back on her shoulders. One problem at a time. Right now, preserving the historical record is more important than saving the property. She checked her phone and found a text message from Dr. Running Bear. Documents secure. University archive locked down. Contact established with state police. Will update in morning. At least that part of the plan worked, Sarah said, showing Frank the message. They discussed their options until nearly 2 a.m., eventually agreeing that their next step should be consulting with a lawyer specializing in historical artifacts and treasure claims. Finally, exhaustion overtook them and they settled into uneasy sleep. Sarah was awakened at 6:15 a.m. by her ringing phone. The caller ID showed Dr. Running Bear. Sarah, are you and Frank safe? The historian asked urgently. Yes, we're at the motel. What's happening? The state police went to the ranch last night after my call. They found the house empty. No sign of Prescott's men. But they did find evidence of forced entry and a thorough search. They're treating it as a break-in. Did they find the vault? No, I didn't tell them about that yet, but there's more. I got a call from Senator Prescott himself this morning. Sarah sat up straight, fully alert now. What did he want? to arrange a meeting with you. He claims there's been a misunderstanding and wants to discuss the situation like civilized people, his words. After sending armed men to raid the ranch, that's some misunderstanding. I agree it's suspicious, Dr. Running Bear said cautiously. But he's insisting this meeting happens today. He mentioned that he could resolve the foreclosure situation favorably if you're willing to be reasonable about certain historical materials. He's trying to buy me off, Sarah realized. Just like he threatened last night. Possibly, the historian agreed. But there's something else you should know. I had a colleague at the university examine some of Crawford's journal entries, specifically the ones describing his death fears in the weeks before he died. There are parallels to Robert's situation that can't be ignored. What kind of parallels? Crawford mentions being followed strange cars near the property, concerns about being silenced before he could expose the truth, and the manner of his death, found at the bottom of the basement stairs, is remarkably similar to what happened to another man who threatened Prescott interests in the 1950s. My colleague found newspaper accounts of at least 3 suspicious deaths over the decades, all individuals who were investigating aspects of the Prescott family history. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the motel's inadequate heating. You think Robert was murdered, that his aneurysm wasn't natural? I think it deserves investigation, Dr. Running Bear replied carefully. Certain compounds can induce symptoms similar to an aneurysm rupture, if Robert was getting close to exposing the origins of the Prescott fortune. Frank, now awake and listening, shook his head in disbelief. This is like something from a crime novel, not Wyoming history. History is often darker than the sanitized versions we're taught, Dr. Running Bear responded. Fortunes aren't usually built through noble means, especially in frontier territories. So what do we do about Prescott's meeting request? Sarah asked. I think you should meet him, the historian said surprisingly. But not alone and not on his terms. I've arranged for a meeting at the University History Department at noon. Captain Blackhawk of the State Police will be present along with the university's legal counsel. If Prescott wants to talk, he can do it with witnesses. Sarah considered this, and the documents, secure in the university archive, officially logged and under preservation protocols. If they mysteriously disappear now, there will be serious questions. Okay, Sarah decided. We'll be there, but first Frank and I need to make a stop. After ending the call, she turned to Frank. Before we meet Prescott, I want to talk to my friend at the medical examiner's office. If there's any possibility Robert was murdered, I need to know. Dr. Elaine Chen had been the assistant medical examiner who processed Robert's case, and she was also a personal friend of Sarah's through the museum. When they arrived at her office that morning, she greeted Sarah with a concerned embrace. I've been worried about you, Dr. Chen said. With the foreclosure notice and everything, how are you holding up? It's been a difficult time, Sarah acknowledged. But I have some questions about Robert's death that I need answered. Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. What kind of questions? Is it possible his aneurysm wasn't natural? Could it have been induced somehow? The medical examiner's eyes widened slightly. That's a very specific question, Sarah. Do you have reason to suspect foul play? Sarah carefully explained what they had discovered. The vault, the historical documents implicating the Prescott family, the armed men who had searched the ranch. Dr. Chen listened without interruption, her professional demeanor never slipping despite the extraordinary nature of Sarah's account. From a medical perspective, she said when Sarah finished, certain toxins can cause symptoms mimicking an aneurysm rupture. It's rare but possible. We didn't run a full toxicology panel on Robert because there was no indication of foul play. He had a documented history of hypertension, a known risk factor for aneurysms. But if someone wanted to make a murder look natural, Frank suggested. Dr. Chen nodded reluctantly. It would be a sophisticated approach, but yes, possible. We still have tissue samples preserved. I could request additional testing, but I'd need reasonable cause. Would the circumstances I've described qualify? Sarah asked. Let me make some calls, Dr. Chen said, reaching for her phone. No promises, but I'll see what I can do. By 11:30 a.m., Sarah and Frank were walking across the University of Wyoming campus toward the history department. The imposing stone buildings dusted with fresh snow seemed an appropriate setting for the confrontation with a man whose family had helped shape the state's development through means both public and hidden. Dr. Running Bear met them at the entrance to the history building. Senator Prescott arrived 10 minutes ago, she informed them quietly, with 2 aides and his personal attorney. Captain Blackhawk is also here along with our university counsel. Any news from Dr. Chen? Frank asked Sarah. She's expediting the additional tests, Sarah replied. We should know something in a few days. They followed Dr. Running Bear to a wood-paneled conference room where 6 people were already seated around a large oval table. Senator William Prescott dominated the space despite his moderate stature, a man in his early 60s with silver hair, an expensive suit, and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to power. His eyes locked onto Sarah as she entered, assessing her with calculation barely concealed beneath a politician's practiced smile. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, rising slightly. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Sarah took the empty seat directly across from him, feeling the weight of the moment. This man's great-grandfather had built a fortune through fraud and corruption. That fortune had created the political dynasty that shaped Wyoming for generations. And now the truth about those origins was threatening to emerge from the shadows of history. Senator Prescott, she acknowledged coolly. I believe we have a lot to discuss about Samuel Crawford's vault and what it reveals about your family's history. The senator's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened perceptibly. Indeed we do, Mrs. Mitchell. Indeed we do. The stage was set for a confrontation between historical truth and the power that had been built upon its deliberate concealment. In the balance hung not just the fate of the Mitchell Ranch, but the untold story of how Wyoming's wealth and influence had truly been distributed during its formative years. Senator William Prescott leaned forward in his chair, hands clasped on the polished conference table. His practiced smile never reached his eyes, cold calculating windows to a man accustomed to getting his way. On either side sat his aides and personal attorney, their expressions professionally neutral but alert, like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Mrs. Mitchell, Prescott began, his voice carrying the smooth cadence of a seasoned politician. I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding. My security team was simply attempting to recover stolen family documents. Their methods may have been overzealous, and for that I apologize. Sarah met his gaze unflinchingly. Stolen documents. Everything my husband researched came from public archives or legitimate historical sources. That may be your perspective, Prescott countered, but certain materials relating to Samuel Crawford's business arrangements with my great-grandfather were removed from our family collection without authorization many years ago. We've been attempting to recover them for some time. Captain James Blackhawk of the Wyoming State Police, a tall man with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades enforcing the law in harsh environments, cleared his throat. Senator, unauthorized armed personnel conducting a raid on private property is a serious matter regardless of the circumstances. A misunderstanding, Prescott repeated smoothly. My security team was given incorrect information about potential trespassers. Had I known Mrs. Mitchell was on the property, I would have arranged a civilized conversation, much like this one. Dr. Running Bear opened a folder containing photocopies of several ledger pages. Senator, these documents were found in a hidden vault on the Mitchell property. They detail an extensive operation to move gold outside official channels during Wyoming's territorial period. Your great-grandfather's name appears throughout, along with evidence of systematic fraud in mining claim acquisitions. The senator barely glanced at the documents. Historical business records can be easily misinterpreted by modern standards. The territorial period operated under different legal frameworks. What might seem questionable today was standard practice then. Fraud and corruption were illegal then too, Senator, Sarah said quietly. A flash of anger crossed Prescott's face before his political mask reasserted itself. Mrs. Mitchell, let me be direct. These materials, regardless of how you interpret them, relate to my family's private business affairs. I'm prepared to offer you $5 million for exclusive rights to all documents found on your property relating to Samuel Crawford and his business associates. The room fell silent. $5 million. 40 times what Sarah needed to save the ranch from foreclosure. And if I decline? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Prescott's smile thinned. Then things become considerably more complicated. Your property faces foreclosure in 2 days. Banks can be influenced, titles can be challenged, historical artifacts can be claimed under various statutes. The legal process could tie up any potential value in these discoveries for decades. It was a threat thinly veiled but unmistakable. Accept our terms, or we'll use our considerable influence to ensure you get nothing. What about my husband's research? His life's work? A tragic loss, Prescott acknowledged with feigned sympathy, but ultimately just unfinished notes and theories. Without the primary sources to support them, they remain speculation. Sarah felt a surge of anger. This man was proposing to erase not just historical truth, but Robert's legacy, the discoveries that may have cost him his life. "Senator," she said carefully, "are you aware that the State Historical Preservation Office has been notified about our discovery? Once it's officially documented, these materials will be protected under Wyoming's cultural heritage laws." A flash of genuine concern crossed Prescott's face. A premature action. Proper assessment requires experts who understand the historical context. My foundation employs several respected historians who would be better suited to evaluate these materials. The university's legal counsel, a woman in her 50s with a stern expression, leaned forward. "Senator Prescott, I should inform you that the documents in question have already been officially accessioned into the university's historical archive. They're now part of the public historical record subject to scholarly examination and preservation protocols." Prescott's expression darkened, his political veneer cracking to reveal the calculation beneath. "That was premature and potentially legally problematic. My family will challenge any public display or publication of those materials." "On what grounds?" Dr. Runningbear asked. "Privacy, defamation, intellectual property. My legal team will determine the specifics." The threat hung in the air, heavy and explicit. Captain Blackhawk shifted in his seat. "Senator, I am more concerned with the armed individuals who entered the Mitchell property without authorization. That's a criminal matter requiring investigation." "A misunderstanding," Prescott repeated, his tone hardening. "My security team was responding to reports of trespassers. If Mrs. Mitchell had simply answered my call rather than fleeing the property with historical materials of questionable provenance." "The provenance isn't questionable," Sarah interrupted. "The vault was found on my property in a structure that's been there since 1885. The materials inside document historical events relevant to Wyoming's development. They belong in the historical record, not buried in private archives." Prescott's practiced smile disappeared entirely. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're making a serious mistake. My family has shaped Wyoming's destiny for generations. We've built this state's infrastructure, created thousands of jobs, preserved millions of acres of wilderness. That legacy won't be tarnished by selective interpretations of century-old business practices. If your family's contributions are as significant as you say, surely they can withstand historical scrutiny," Sarah replied, standing her ground. The senator rose abruptly, signaling to his entourage, "This conversation is clearly unproductive. My attorneys will be in touch regarding the unauthorized possession of Prescott family historical materials. I strongly advise you to reconsider my offer before this situation escalates further." As he reached the door, he turned back to deliver a final warning. "Remember, Mrs. Mitchell, in 2 days your ranch will belong to the bank. Consider carefully what you're sacrificing for documents you barely understand." After Prescott's departure, the room remained silent for several moments. Finally, Captain Blackhawk spoke. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'd advise caution. The senator has considerable influence in this state." "I'm aware," Sarah replied, "but these documents don't just belong to me or to the Prescott family. They're part of Wyoming's history, a chapter that's been deliberately erased until now." The university's legal counsel nodded thoughtfully. "From a legal perspective, your position is strong. As the property owner who discovered these artifacts, Wyoming law grants you significant rights. However, the senator has resources to delay and complicate any resolution." "The immediate concern is the ranch foreclosure," Frank pointed out. "If Sarah loses the property in 2 days, it complicates her claim to what was found there." Dr. Runningbear had been examining her notes. "There might be a solution. The discovery of a historically significant site can trigger emergency preservation protocols under the Wyoming Cultural Resources Act. If we can get the state archaeologist to issue a protection order, it would temporarily suspend any transfer of ownership pending a full assessment." "How quickly can that happen?" Sarah asked. "I know the state archaeologist personally," Dr. Runningbear replied. "With the documentation we've already assembled, she could issue an emergency order by tomorrow morning." "Do it," Sarah decided. "And Frank, could you contact Martin Webb at the county assessor's office? If the property is designated a historical site, it might affect the foreclosure proceedings." As they developed their strategy, Sarah's phone rang. It was Dr. Chen from the medical examiner's office. "Sarah." The doctor's voice was tight with professional concern. "I expedited those additional tests on Robert's tissue samples. The results just came back. There were traces of a compound called tetrodotoxin in his system. It's a neurotoxin that can cause symptoms mimicking an aneurysm in small doses. It's not something that would appear in standard toxicology screening." Sarah's hand tightened around the phone. You're saying Robert was poisoned. I'm saying there's evidence consistent with poisoning. Yes, it's extremely rare and would require specialized knowledge to administer. I've already contacted the state police about reopening the investigation into his death. After ending the call, Sarah relayed the information to the others. Captain Blackhawk immediately stepped out to make calls to his department. This changes everything, Dr. Running Bear said quietly. If Robert was murdered because of what he discovered, it means someone was willing to kill to keep Crawford's vault secret, Frank finished grimly. The timing can't be coincidence, Sarah added. Robert finds the entrance to the vault, calls me excitedly saying he's about to make a huge discovery, and then dies before he can show anyone. When Captain Blackhawk returned, his expression was grave. Mrs. Mitchell, I've initiated a formal investigation into your husband's death. Given the circumstances and new evidence, we're treating this as a potential homicide. I'd like to assign officers to ensure your safety until we better understand the situation. The next morning dawned clear and cold over Wyoming. Sarah awoke in a university guest apartment where she'd spent the night under police protection. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, she felt a strange calm, the certainty that comes from pursuing truth regardless of consequences. Dr. Running Bear arrived early with positive news. The state archaeologist has issued an emergency protection order for the ranch property. It's officially designated as a site of exceptional historical significance pending full assessment. The bank can proceed with foreclosure while the order is in effect. Frank joined them with additional developments. I spoke with the county assessor. Once the historical designation is finalized, the property will qualify for preservation tax credits and potentially state conservation funding. It won't solve the financial problems immediately, but it creates breathing room. By noon, they had assembled a formidable team in the university's history department. Dr. Running Bear's academic colleagues, the state archaeologist representatives from the Wyoming Historical Society, and legal experts in cultural preservation. Together, they began the process of documenting and contextualizing the extraordinary find from Crawford's vault. Based on these ledgers, explained Dr. Harmon, the state archaeologist, we can connect the Mitchell Ranch to the underground Gold Road, the secret transport network that operated during territorial days. The tunnel system you discovered would be one of the only intact examples ever found. That alone makes this site historically priceless. As the historical significance of the discovery became clearer, Sarah received a call from Captain Blackhawk. Mrs. Mitchell, we've made progress in the investigation. We've obtained security footage from the university archive where your husband conducted research 3 months ago. It shows him being followed by a man we've identified as James Corcoran, head of security for the Prescott Foundation. The same organization that sent men to search my ranch, Sarah asked. The very same. We're bringing Corcoran in for questioning. Additionally, we've executed a search warrant at his residence and found evidence suggesting he's been involved in monitoring historical researchers across the state, anyone looking into territorial era records relating to certain families. The implications were staggering. If the Prescott Foundation had been systematically tracking and potentially silencing historical researchers, the conspiracy extended far beyond Robert's death. By mid-afternoon, Sarah returned to the ranch accompanied by Captain Blackhawk, Frank, and a team of state archaeologists. The property was now under police protection with officers stationed at the entrance and perimeter. The basement and hidden vault had been carefully cordoned off as a crime scene and historical site. Dr. Harmon supervised the initial archaeological assessment, meticulously documenting every aspect of the hidden chamber and tunnel system. This is extraordinary, she told Sarah as they examined the tunnel entrance. The construction techniques match descriptions from miners' journals, but this is the first physical evidence we've found intact. The historical value is incalculable. Sarah watched the professionals working in the space where Robert had made his final discovery, feeling both grief and vindication. He knew how important this was. That's why he was so careful with his research, so methodical in his documentation. And your husband's work will be recognized, Dr. Harmon assured her. This discovery will rewrite our understanding of Wyoming's development during the territorial period. As the archaeologists continued their work, Captain Blackhawk approached with news. Mrs. Mitchell, James Corcoran has been cooperative under questioning. He's admitted to monitoring your husband's research and following him on several occasions. More significantly, he's implicated Richard Prescott, the senator's son, in directing these activities. And Robert's death, Sarah asks, steeling herself for the answer. Corcoran denies any involvement, but forensic evidence from his vehicle and electronic devices suggests he was at your ranch the day your husband died. We're continuing to build the case. The next morning brought the formal announcement that shocked Wyoming's political establishment. The state attorney general held a press conference announcing the investigation into Robert Mitchell's death and the potential involvement of the Prescott Foundation in systematic efforts to suppress historical research. Senator Prescott issued an immediate statement distancing himself from the foundation's security operations, claiming no knowledge of any illegal activities. But the damage was done. News outlets across the state were connecting the discovery at the Mitchell Ranch to the origins of the Prescott fortune and the family's century of political influence. By the time the bank's foreclosure deadline arrived, it had become moot. The emergency protection order had been extended indefinitely, and the national attention generated by the discovery had transformed the ranch from a financial liability into a historical asset of immense significance. 3 weeks after the discovery of the vault, Sarah sat in the conference room of the Wyoming Historical Society in Cheyenne, surrounded by historians, archivists, and legal experts. The long mahogany table was covered with carefully preserved documents, Crawford's ledgers, journals, and correspondence now protected in acid-free sleeves and conservation folders. "The preservation work is nearly complete," Dr. Running Bear announced to the assembled team. "We've digitized every document and created a searchable database of Crawford's records. The historical significance of this collection cannot be overstated. It provides unprecedented insight into the financial networks that shaped Wyoming's transition from territory to statehood." Sarah felt a quiet pride as she watched the historians poring over the materials Robert had discovered. The ranch had been officially designated a historical site of exceptional significance, protecting it from foreclosure and ensuring that the vault and its contents would be properly preserved for future generations. "Mrs. Mitchell," said Dr. Harmon, the state archaeologist, "I've completed my assessment of the gold coins and bullion from the vault. Based on current market values and the exceptional numismatic significance of the collection, we're looking at a total value of approximately $212 million. A murmur ran through the room. Despite weeks of work, the sheer scale of the discovery remained staggering. As the property owner who discovered these materials, Harmon continued, Wyoming law entitles you to 70% of the financial value, with the remaining 30% allocated to the State Historical Trust. That's nearly $150 million, Mrs. Mitchell. Sarah nodded, still processing the transformation of her circumstances from the brink of foreclosure to enormous wealth in less than a month. It was a change that still felt surreal. "What's the status of Senator Prescott's legal challenge?" asked Frank, who had remained by Sarah's side throughout the process. The legal team exchanged glances before responding. "The senator's attempt to claim ancestral ownership of the vault's contents has been rejected by the district court. His subsequent efforts to have the materials classified as state property have also failed, thanks largely to the documentation of Mrs. Mitchell's legitimate discovery claim. He won't give up easily," Dr. Running Bear cautioned. "The Prescott family has too much at stake." Sarah understood the historian's concern. In the weeks since the discovery, their research team had pieced together the true significance of Crawford's records. The documents didn't just reveal how Harold Prescott had built his fortune through corruption and fraud. They provided evidence of a systematic campaign to consolidate wealth and power among a small circle of territorial elites, using means that ranged from questionable to outright criminal. "There's also the matter of your husband's death," said Captain Blackhawk, who had joined the meeting to provide an update on the investigation. "The district attorney has filed formal charges against James Corcoran for second-degree murder. Richard Prescott has been charged as an accessory. The evidence is compelling." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions: grief for Robert's satisfaction that justice was being pursued, and a deep sense of purpose that had emerged from the tragedy. Her husband's meticulous research had not only uncovered historical truth but had set in motion a reckoning with the forces that had shaped Wyoming for generations. "I've made a decision about my portion of the proceeds," she announced as the meeting was concluding. "I'm establishing the Robert Mitchell Foundation for Historical Truth. Half of my share will fund ongoing research into the hidden financial networks that shaped Wyoming's development. The other half will restore the ranch as a research center and public education facility." Dr. Running Bear smiled with approval. Robert would be proud. He always said that understanding our true history was more valuable than any treasure. The ranch was never just about cattle or land to him. It was about uncovering the stories that shaped this landscape, Sarah reflected. Stories that powerful interests tried to erase. As the meeting disbanded, Sarah found herself standing alone with Captain Blackhawk near the building's large windows overlooking the Wyoming state capitol. The imposing structure built during the period documented in Crawford's ledgers now seemed like a physical manifestation of the power structures they were uncovering. Senator Prescott has called an emergency press conference for this afternoon, Blackhawk mentioned, checking his phone. Apparently he's announcing his retirement from public life effective immediately. Running before the truth catches up to him, Sarah observed. Perhaps making a strategic retreat to protect what remains of his family's reputation. Blackhawk studied Sarah with professional assessment. You've made powerful enemies, Mrs. Mitchell. The kind who don't forget or forgive easily. I'm not afraid, Sarah replied, surprising herself with the truth of the statement. Robert believed this history deserved to be told no matter the consequences. I won't dishonor his courage by showing less. That evening Sarah returned to the ranch for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The property had been transformed. State Historical Society personnel were carefully documenting every aspect of the historic buildings and the vault beneath them. The foreclosure signs had been removed, replaced by official markers designating the site's protected status. Frank met her at the entrance, clipboard in hand, as he supervised the installation of a state-of-the-art security system. "Welcome home," he said with a warm smile. Or should I say, welcome to the future Mitchell Historical Research Center. Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. It still doesn't feel real, Frank. 3 weeks ago, I was about to lose everything. Now you're one of the wealthiest women in Wyoming, and about to become one of its most influential historians, he finished. Life can change in an instant. Robert always said this place held secrets that would change everything. She remembered looking across the property with new eyes. I thought he was being romantic about old legends and myths. I never imagined he was so literally right. They walked together toward the ranch house, which was already being carefully restored to its historical appearance while being updated with the modern research facilities. The transformation from failing cattle operation to cutting-edge historical center was well underway. Dr. Running Bear called, Frank mentioned as they reached the porch. The first academic paper based on Crawford's documents has been accepted for publication in the Western Historical Quarterly. It details how the Prescott fortune was built on manipulated mining claims and political corruption. That's just the beginning, Sarah said. Robert's research notes connect at least 12 prominent Wyoming families to Crawford's operation. The full truth will take years to uncover. Some people won't thank you for it, Frank cautioned. Revealing that the founding fortunes of Wyoming were built on corruption challenges a lot of cherished myths. Truth is rarely comfortable, Sarah acknowledged, but it's necessary. Robert understood that history isn't just about celebrating accomplishments. It's about understanding the full complexity of how we got here, including the darker chapters. Inside the ranch house, Sarah found her way to what had been Robert's study. The room had been carefully preserved, his research materials now properly archived, but his presence still palpable in the space he had loved. On his desk sat a framed photograph of the two of them taken on the day they had first visited the ranch together. I understand now, she said softly to his image. Why this place meant so much to you. Why you never gave up on it even when everyone else thought it was worthless. She placed beside the photograph a small gold coin, one of Crawford's double eagles that had been released back to her after authentication. The physical connection between past and present, between the hidden history and its modern revelation, felt deeply appropriate. A knock at the open door drew her attention. Dr. Running Bear stood there holding a leather-bound journal that Sarah recognized as one of Crawford's personal diaries. I thought you might want to see this entry, the historian said, opening the journal to a marked page. It seems particularly relevant to your current situation. Sarah accepted the journal and read the passage indicated April 15, 1892. I have come to understand that wealth itself is not the true measure of value. The gold I have accumulated means nothing compared to the truth I have documented. Those who build fortunes through deception fear nothing more than honest accounting of their methods. Perhaps this record I have kept will someday serve as correction to the false histories they will undoubtedly commission to glorify their names. Truth buried for a time has a way of surfacing when it is most needed. 7 days after writing those words, Samuel Crawford had been found dead at the bottom of his basement stairs. His hidden vault had remained sealed for over a century, preserving both his accumulated wealth and his meticulous documentation of corruption. He knew, Sarah said quietly, he knew the risks he was taking by keeping these records. Just as Robert knew the risks of uncovering them, Dr. Running Bear agreed. Both men understood that some truths are worth protecting even at great personal cost. The difference is that Crawford's truth remained buried, Sarah replied, a new determination in her voice. Robert's won't be. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the podium during the official opening of the Robert Mitchell Center for Historical Research. The restored ranch house gleamed in the summer sunshine, its historic character preserved, while state-of-the-art research facilities had been integrated throughout the property. The hidden vault had been carefully stabilized and preserved, now accessible to visitors through a specially designed viewing area that protected the original structure. Before her stood historians, journalists, students, and community members, all drawn by the remarkable story of Crawford's vault and the hidden history it had revealed. Among the audience, Sarah noted representatives from several prominent Wyoming families mentioned in Crawford's ledgers, some looking uncomfortable, others seemingly curious about revelations that might challenge their family narratives. "Welcome to the Mitchell Center for Historical Truth," she began. "This place exists because one man refused to accept that some truths should remain buried. My husband, Robert Mitchell, dedicated years to uncovering the hidden history of this property, not for personal gain, but because he believed understanding our true past is essential to creating a more just future." She gestured to displays around them, carefully preserved documents, photographs, and artifacts that told the story of Crawford's operation and the financial networks that had shaped Wyoming's development. "The treasure we discovered beneath this ranch isn't just valuable for its gold content. Its true worth lies in the historical record it preserved, evidence of how wealth and power were accumulated during Wyoming's formative years, often through means that contradicted our cherished myths about frontier opportunity and equal access." The assembled guests listened intently, many taking notes or recording her words. "This center is dedicated to revealing historical truth in all its complexity," she continued, "not to assign blame to current generations for the actions of their ancestors, but to foster honest understanding of how our present circumstances were shaped by past decisions. Only by acknowledging our full history, including its darker chapters, can we move forward with genuine progress." As she concluded her remarks, Sarah felt Robert's presence strongly. Not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the living continuation of his passion and principles. The work he had begun would continue expanding beyond what even he might have imagined. Later that afternoon, as the first official day of the Mitchell Center drew to a close, Sarah found herself alone in the basement where it had all begun. The hidden entrance to Crawford's vault was now preserved behind clear security panels, allowing visitors to see the stonework and symbols while protecting the historical structure. "You were right," she said softly, knowing Robert couldn't hear but feeling the need to acknowledge his vision. This place was never just a struggling ranch. It was the keeper of secrets that needed to be told. A gentle hand on her shoulder made her turn. Frank stood there, respect and something deeper in his eyes. "The last visitors have left," he said, "but Dr. Runningbear's team wants to stay and continue working with the ledgers. They found something about land transfers during the 1890s that might connect to current water rights disputes." Sarah smiled. "Let them stay as long as they need. That's exactly what this place is for now." Together they climbed the stairs to the main floor, where the ranch house windows framed a spectacular Wyoming sunset. The failing cattle operation that had seemed like such a burden had transformed into something far more valuable. A center for historical truth, a memorial to Robert's courage, and a resource for generations to come. The $212 million treasure had secured the ranch's financial future. But Sarah understood now that the true wealth had been there all along. Buried not just in gold, but in the historical record that powerful interests had tried to suppress for over a century. "You know," Frank said thoughtfully, "most people who find treasure just take the money and run. Buy an island, live in luxury, forget about responsibility." "I'm not most people," Sarah replied, "and this isn't just treasure, it's a legacy not just of wealth but of truth." Robert understood that. Crawford understood it too in his way. Some things are worth more than gold. As darkness fell over the Mitchell Center, lights came on throughout the property, illuminating not just the physical spaces, but symbolically bringing light to histories that had remained in darkness for generations. The struggling cattle ranch had revealed its true purpose, becoming a beacon of historical truth in a landscape too often shaped by carefully managed narratives. And Sarah Mitchell, who had inherited far more than she ever imagined, had found her own purpose as well, not just as the beneficiary of a remarkable discovery, but as the guardian of a legacy that would continue to reveal its significance for generations to come. The treasure vault that had remained hidden for over a century had transformed not just her fortunes but her understanding of wealth itself, teaching her that the most valuable inheritances aren't measured in dollars but in truth, courage, and the commitment to ensuring that buried histories don't remain underground forever.